Excellent. Great. Thanks for showing up. I'm Austin. I work with Solana Labs. Going to run you through a bit of stuff quickly here today. Going to leave most of the time for questions because really everything we're talking about is publicly available on the internet. So let's get into some of the fun stuff. So Solana, powerful developers, fast for everyone. This is sort of the constructed paradigm of the network, decentralized blockchain built for scalability to bring user-friendly apps to the world. We sort of set an internal benchmark around, how can a network support several billion users? And that's sort of what all of the development effort goes into supporting and expanding. So proof of stake with proof of history turbocharger. Proof of history is effectively a clock before consensus that enables fast transactions. It also enables quick block finality, lots of things that are important for certain kinds of applications, and a lot of the Web 2 experiences we're really used to today rely on really fast response times from systems. Rust, C, C++. There's a new framework called Anchor, which has been in process of development, which is sort of an abstraction layer for programming. Serum's done a bunch of work on that. That's gaining a huge amount of traction from developers. We've been seeing some of those repos start trending on GitHub, which is always kind of just a fun thing to see when you're looking at stuff. And there's a really important concept here, which is the program library and reusability concept. So if you are using a piece of program that already exists on chain, you don't necessarily need to deploy your own code. You can use that program with your own input systems. A lot of on-chain governance systems are looking at this sort of thing. And it really, like the NFT minting contract for something like Metaplex is a reusable program on chain. So you don't have to deploy the whole new contract every time, as long as you sort of trust the authenticity and the open source creation of that and the origin for it. Some high-level performance metrics and architecture. So the mainnet beta launched in March of 2020, so things have been going pretty decent since then. 28 billion transactions. The set network rate's about 2,500 transactions per second right now, and that's far below what the capacity is, but that's just sort of the steady state of operations on the network. We're running about 400 millisecond block times, 65,000 transactions per second, sort of like peak capacity on that. That's up from about 50,000 when the network launched, because one of the key differentiators with Solana is that as networking hardware and computational power increases, that increases the throughput of the network. So developers have the opportunity there to either add additional security or keep the network scaling from a transaction count perspective. And this will continue to grow over time as Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, et cetera, invest their hundreds of millions of dollars a year into R&D. So we get to piggyback on that, which is nice. There's full composability without sharding, which is another paradigm difference from a lot of the sort of, we call them third, fourth, second generation blockchain systems out there. So that's kind of like a major paradigm shift from what a lot of the other systems out there are doing. There's advantages and disadvantages to everything like this, of course. But one of the nice things about sharding is you get a consistent state that you can program in. That's the way people are used to building things on Ethereum, and there's a lot of tooling built to make that possible. Right now, there's about 980 consensus participating staked validators. In addition to that, there's a whole series. This number here you'll see is a little higher because that includes validators that are operational but may not have stake on them or are delinquent. You also have RPC nodes, which are sort of the infrastructure that supports talking to a blockchain. There are hundreds of those running across the world right now. And this is data from Solana Beach if you ever want to check any of this out yourself. So some of the interesting things that have happened in the last 6 months, these are protocol level and ecosystem level features and frameworks for improvements here. Stake pools, which is a protocol native liquid staking solution, which allows anyone to launch a contract that you can attach stake to. That stake can go out to a whole distributed set of validators to keep the network decentralized, but then you get a liquid staking token, which can be used in DeFi and other applications as well. We expect to see a large amount of stake of the network move into that sort of a paradigm in the near future. As I said, the RPC infrastructure is scaling out quite extensively. Some other things to talk about. Metaplex was launched by the community earlier this year. Metaplex is an open source NFT minting framework. So what's cool about this is the actual auctioning and the minting of NFTs all takes place on chain, and then users can spin up their own front ends hosted wherever they would like to host them. We've seen a lot of early adoption of this. because of the network design of Solana, the media is actually stored on Arweave. I know Sam was up here yesterday talking. Arweave is an incredibly interesting long-term data storage protocol that has some CDNs attached to it. So that's actually where all the asset and media components for any NFTs that are created on Solana actually exist. And Candy Machine is sort of related to this. It's a new paradigm for how you can launch NFTs with a system that makes it, I would say, that reduces the demands on infrastructure and increases sort of the fair launch potential. It's sort of an anti-bot system, but it also makes the requirements for a lot of these artists who are maybe starting out, and while they may have quite successful jobs, they don't know they're going to have that in the future, and they don't want to put as much effort or money into supporting a 150,000 person audience that's all going to try and mint at the same time. Some other things to talk about here, Wormhole and bridges. So Wormhole has launched their Ethereum to Solana asset bridge. There's NFT bridges in the works as well. They're expanding out to a huge number of different networks. The Oracle ecosystem on Solana is building up too. Pyth has recently launched their Oracle for Solana. Happy has one, and Chainlink, they say by the end of the year, it's running on DevNet now. They should have a mainnet launch by the end of the year for Chainlink support, which is great to see. And then indexers and those sort of solutions, which are really important as a protocol builds out in its maturity. There's centralized and decentralized indexer solutions that are being deployed right now. There's a few companies that provide centralized solutions, but our real focus is how do we decentralize that indexing system. So just like with ETH, you run an ETH archival node for certain kinds of activities that you can't get from an ETH full node. The indexers play a similar role in the Solana ecosystem. So if you want to get the historic price of an NFT because the sales are all on chain and the auctioning mechanisms are all on chain, that data may or may not be in the active ledger of your validator because it's a weak subjectivity chain. So the indexers and the archival solutions really allow that historic data to be pulled in. And there's a bunch of analytics firms that are also really excited about this kind of thing as well. So other ecosystem updates, DeFi, NFTs, and an EVM layer. These are kind of some of the main things that are coming from community. We've seen that it's now the number 3 chain in terms of TVL, somewhere around 9 billion, depending on how asset prices adjust. Serum, Saber, Radium, Mango Markets, those are some of the big names right now that have all sort of, I'd say, launched or come into fruition in the last 9 months. On the NFT side, Metaplex launched early June. Since then, there's been about 350,000 NFTs that have been minted using the Metaplex system. That's just one of the NFT minting frameworks that exist on Solana, but they're all, there's been a nice community effort to collate the standard down into one thing, so you now see interoperability between different things that are happening within Solana, which is really exciting. It's about 380 million in market caps on NFTs with about $20 million of 7-day trading volume. These numbers are still in flux, and one drop can push that over or under. But that's really the place we're looking at for now. You see groups like Live Nation, the Lollapalooza festival earlier this year, they used Solana to power their NFT marketplace they're experimenting in, and Live Nation's considering what future steps look like for that. But that's kind of an interesting place we're starting to see more adoption, is like when corporate partners look at like how do you build on a blockchain with an NFT system. They're looking at low fees. They're looking at ways they can retain perpetual royalties, a lot of those sorts of things. That's not like what Metaplex was designed for. But again, the whole beauty of this stuff is you never actually know how someone's going to use it in the real world until it gets out there. And so we're seeing this really interesting mix of like truly independent NFT projects and then like large brands that are trying to move into the space looking at both Solana and Metaplex as a potential framework to build on. And then just some ecosystem highlights. There's 14 independent ecosystem funds with about 300 million deployable. There's a good chunk of that that's been deployed. We've ran 3 hackathons since the start of the year, about 15,000 participants in total for that have raised about 10 million plus in seed round funding coming out of that, as well as some substantial subsequent rounds, including someone like Mango, who recently did a nice fair launch of their token. So that's all pretty quick. Again, all this information is publicly available, so would love to get into some questions, and then Solana.com to learn more about this stuff.
So the Solana network is labeled as a mainnet beta.
Yes.
Would you consider that the final product, or is it something that's evolving, or what would you say is the end goal for that kind of state of the network?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, no software package in open source development is ever done. If it's done, the project's usually dead. So that beta tag really is there because there are a number of things that still need improvement. A great example of this is like the RPC infrastructure for Solana. It's not as efficient as it really needs to be to support billions and billions of users. That's sort of the network that a dApp would talk to submit transactions to the actual blockchain, that interface layer. Most developers run their own right now. There's some centralized services that offer them too. But that is an example of like a software package that like really isn't mature enough to warrant removing a beta tag from it. But we kind of joke internally, like, when do you remove the beta? And it's kind of just up to the community in some ways. It's not really a status that like Solana Foundation or something like that really can say.
And so Solana recently had an outage related to the way that the network essentially handles consensus in parallel with transactions. On a simplest level, that was part of the problem. And you haven't released a formal post-mortem yet, so I would imagine there's still a lot of looking into the root cause and figuring out what the correct long-term solution is. I was just wondering if you could share any thoughts on just kind of a first reaction where you are now and how you're kind of taking those steps from there.
Yeah, so there was about a 17-hour network outage that occurred. There was really a pretty massive community effort to come in, identify problems, reach consensus around, what was the last block of forward progress, and then once the software patch was ready, which had about 10 different teams across the world working on sort of developing that. Once that was ready for release, the network was back up and running in about 2 hours and 45 minutes because the validator community elected to adopt this and keep the network running, which is like awesome to see. That was a real moment of about 400 validators were the minimum requirement to get that restarted, all coming together. And so, in terms of like the outage, this is kind of an interesting thing because there's a bunch of quality of service improvements that were in the pipeline but hadn't been deployed yet. And so the difficulty with this, and there's a full technical postmortem coming. We released the Solana Foundation released a small statement just to keep people updated on what's going on. But there wasn't the appropriate quality of service filtering in place in the network stack level to make sure that when a huge amount of transactions that were fairly complicated came in, that the consensus could keep running as a part of that. So there's a lot of there's a lot of work on the engineering teams both at Solana and then across the ecosystem to really make sure that's a more robust system.
Yeah, and I think with networks in general, things go wrong, things break, and you see that with pretty much every network. I think one of the things that you see on other networks that you might not see on Solana yet is this idea of client diversity, so that you have the ability to have the opportunity to choose kind of whose code you're running, and you have fail-safes in place in a sense where if there's a bug or an exploit in the single code released by the client, you can switch off of that, and hopefully the entire network can kind of patch into different things. So how do you see, and it's not something that can be done necessarily inorganically, it's something that you see as networks grow and you have these kind of independent developer groups build out around them. I was just curious if you had any thoughts on the direction of that, or if there's any plans of that you know of.
Yeah, I mean, like the client diversity side is something that usually comes quite late in a blockchain development. It took a long time to get there for a lot of other networks, and like that is definitely something that I would love to see. We're starting to see that on the RPC infrastructure side, whereas different people who use that type of infrastructure have different requirements for like their network systems. They're starting to modify that code, and they're starting. Some of the times that gets contributed back to the core repo. Sometimes that's actually its own custom version that they're running. And so I think over time you're going to see more and more of that building out. But yeah, over the long term, like diversity of protocol client is like definitely a priority.
I had a question in my head. Give me a second. Now the pressure's kicking in. Okay, here we go. So on the face value, when people hear about Solana, fast transactions, low fees. It's definitely a lot more complex than that. What do you think? How would you describe kind of the differentiating factors between something like layer 2 on Ethereum, where you have maybe a similar user experience, but it's definitely very different systems, and there's a lot more that goes into it. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. How you?
Yeah. So there's sort of a really interesting way to look at this, which is what is the role of a network like Solana when you have so much value in something like Bitcoin or Ethereum? And there's this idea of an execution layer that can take something that is secured on a settlement layer, and you can use it in all these different applications. So there is no such thing as Bitcoin DeFi, right? All Bitcoin DeFi is using the security of Bitcoin and the asset value of Bitcoin on other networks to participate in DeFi with wrapped Bitcoin, et cetera. So that is a paradigm that really models over to Solana as well. That's why something like the Wormhole Asset Bridge is pretty important. You're seeing people move large amounts of assets from other networks to play in the execution area that is Solana. And so sometimes when you're looking at those sorts of things, there's a very interoperable world that exists, and I think it's sort of arguing what programming language is going to win. The answer is absolutely none of them. We have an incredibly robust and diverse system of computer science that has tons of different programming languages, and yeah, things come into fad or out of fad, but at the end of the day, they all coexist on this thing that we call the internet. And it's about building interconnections between those to let people do what they want to do and take advantages of the different advantages different networks have. So one of these examples is Neon Labs is in pretty short order. It's on testnet right now, but they're deploying on mainnet soon a EVM compatibility layer for Solana. So it's going to allow someone to take bytecode and just run it as if they were running on Ethereum or any other layer 2 scaling solution. So that's one option for developers, that they can come in and they can use code that they already use on a network that can have different performance characteristics than maybe where they're used to operating right now, or it doesn't have some of the programming changes that are necessitated by sharding to make it work on some of the scaling solutions that exist. But it really is up to the user and up to the developer how they want to leverage all these different platforms and tools.
Yeah, that's all the questions I have. Great talk. Thank you.
Cool.